It began in a moment that most would overlook. No grand announcement, no thunderclap from the sky, just silence, and a man staring into the mirror, not recognizing the face that looked back. John had built his life on quiet sacrifices. Each time he bit his tongue, each time he folded himself smaller to keep the peace, a piece of him disappeared, a slow erosion, not of flesh, but of spirit. That morning, the silence cracked. It wasn't rage, it wasn't despair, it was clarity, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers with unmistakable certainty. Something has to change. That mirror didn't just reflect a tired man, it reflected a stranger. Behind the smile, behind the neatly trimmed beard and the buttoned-up shirt, John saw a man who had become a shell. We don't lose ourselves all at once. We give away our fire one apology at a time. We bend, hoping to be loved. We shrink, hoping to be accepted. But love that demands your silence is not love. Acceptance that costs your truth is not acceptance. It's quiet self-betrayal, and it always comes with interest. The more you bleed for approval, the more you will be asked to bleed again. It never ends. The world, John realized, is not calibrated to reward the selfless. It rewards clarity, strength, and sovereignty. Those who sacrifice themselves for others are often admired in passing, but they are rarely followed. People don't worship martyrs. They follow those who lead without asking for permission. They rally behind those who carry themselves with purpose, not apology. There's a moment in every life where a man either awakens or continues to sleepwalk. The sleeping man blends in, obeys the script, and fades into the crowd. The awakened man does not. He recognizes that fairness is a myth sold to the obedient. Power, real power, begins with self-respect. It starts when you stop apologizing for existing. That morning, John whispered 5 words to himself, quietly but with conviction. I reclaim my life today. And with those words, the journey began. Not outwardly, not yet, but within, where all revolutions begin. This wasn't the kind of resolution that needed champagne or fireworks. It needed resolve, repetition, and ruthless honesty. It needed the courage to face the mirror again and not look away. That is where the road to sovereignty begins. In the decision to stop trading your soul for scraps of praise and to finally, fully, stand up. John sat in his car for over an hour that day, parked just outside his office building in downtown Chicago. He wasn't stalling. He was awakening. The world around him moved in its usual rhythm. Hurried footsteps, honking horns, emails waiting for replies. But for the first time in years, John wasn't reacting. He was observing. And in that stillness, something stirred. His entire life had been a performance. At meetings, he smiled when it wasn't deserved. At dinners, he nodded in agreement just to avoid tension. At home, he played the role of dependable, unshakable provider, never faltering, never complaining. But behind the mask, the man had been crumbling. It dawned on him. The mask wasn't just something he wore. It had become who he was. And worse, he had chosen the wrong mask. Not the mask of a leader or a sovereign, but the mask of the appeaser, the servant of approval. Somewhere along the way, he confused kindness with submission. He believed being liked meant being safe. But niceness, without power, is a liability. In American society, where time is money and image is leverage, being too agreeable doesn't earn you favor, it makes you invisible. People don't respect what they can manipulate, they admire those who hold their ground. He thought of the men he respected, leaders who spoke little but moved mountains, mentors who didn't beg for trust but inspired it by presence alone. They weren't cruel, but they weren't available for everyone's comfort either. They had boundaries, and that boundary gave them gravity. John began to understand the game. If he was to regain his life, he had to rewrite his rules. He needed to wear a new mask, not one built on fear, but on choice. A mask of calm strength, of strategic silence, of deliberate words. He would no longer explain himself unless it served a purpose. He would no longer offer warmth when it was expected, only when it was earned. He rolled down his window and took a deep breath. It tasted like early fall, crisp, cool, bracing, and in that breath he made his second vow. I control the mask. The phrase wasn't theatrical, it was a compass. In a world obsessed with perception, power lies not in being read easily, but in being read wisely. From this moment forward, John wouldn't wear a mask to survive. He would wear one to lead. The moment John stepped into the office, he felt it, subtle but unmistakable. People noticed. Not because he said something different, but because he didn't. His usual pleasantries were shorter, his eyes held steadier, and when someone joked at his expense, as they often did, he didn't laugh, he didn't scowl. He simply looked back, unmoved. That calmness was unsettling. Power, he was learning, begins with attention. Not the attention you seek, but the attention you control. In a culture saturated by noise, the ability to direct and withhold attention is a form of dominance. Most people hemorrhage their focus. They give it away to gossip, to notifications, to opinions. And then they wonder why they feel powerless. John remembered a quote he had once scribbled in a journal and promptly forgotten. Where your attention goes, your energy flows. And where your energy flows, your life is built. It hit differently now. Every time he checked his phone mindlessly, every time he replied to a message out of guilt, he wasn't just losing time. He was losing sovereignty. He decided then, no more. His time would be a fortress. Every conversation, every meeting, every glance at a screen, intentional. Not because he needed to become a monk, but because the man who commands his attention commands his life. That's how empires are built, one deliberate act at a time. And the world began to respond. Slowly, but perceptibly. Colleagues who used to interrupt him now paused before speaking. People who once dismissed his input now listened more closely, not because he changed his voice, but because he changed his presence. He was no longer giving energy to be liked. He was conserving energy to be respected. That afternoon, while eating lunch alone, not out of exclusion, but by choice, John reflected on how much time he had wasted. Pleasing others, chasing validation, trying to be everywhere for everyone and ending up nowhere for himself. No more. His attention would become his kingdom, his focus, a weapon. He whispered under his breath, just loud enough to hear himself. My attention is my empire. And with that, another layer of his old self fell away. The man he was becoming didn't chase influence. He attracted it. By the end of the week, John had stopped apologizing for taking up space. He no longer diluted his presence to keep others comfortable. It wasn't arrogance, it was alignment. For years, he'd played a role in a script written by other people. Now, he was writing his own. But that meant facing the truth. Most of his life had been shaped by chains, not physical ones, but invisible, psychological ones, chains of guilt, chains of obligation, chains of fear. He said yes when he wanted to say no. He smiled when he wanted to walk away, all because he feared disappointing others more than he feared betraying himself. This realization was not gentle. It was like waking up in a prison you didn't know you were in. Every time he worried, what will they think? He gave someone else the key to his freedom. Every time he feared losing someone's approval, he surrendered authority over his own life. But here's the bitter truth. Most people don't care about you as deeply as you think. They care about how you make them feel. And when you outgrow their comfort zone, they resist. Not because you're wrong, but because your growth confronts their stagnation. So John stopped shrinking. He stopped dimming his light to soothe the insecure. He chose silence over small talk. He chose clarity over comfort. And when people sensed the shift, some pulled away. That hurt. But not as much as abandoning himself had. He understood now. Freedom requires sacrifice. Sometimes that means losing relationships built on your weakness, but better to stand alone in truth than be surrounded in illusion. This wasn't about being cold. It was about being sovereign. The kind of man who doesn't need approval to validate his decisions. That Friday night, John stood in his kitchen, drinking water from a heavy glass mug. He looked out the window into the quiet Chicago skyline and whispered to the silence, I refuse the chains. It didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like coming home. One brick at a time, he was reclaiming the ground he'd once surrendered. And in that quiet, in that resolve, freedom began to bloom, not as a gift, but as a declaration. The following Monday, John arrived at work early. Not because he needed to impress anyone, but because he chose to. That distinction mattered now. He wasn't operating from pressure, he was operating from intention. And with that shift came a new power, detachment, not apathy, not coldness, but detachment, the ability to care without being owned by the outcome. For too long, John had needed things, approval, validation, affection, and needing made him vulnerable. It gave others leverage over him. He'd mistaken dependency for connection. But he had learned, anything you need from another person becomes a chain around your neck. Whether it's praise from your boss, affection from a partner, or affirmation from society, when your identity depends on it, your freedom vanishes. And those who sense your need will use it to manipulate you. John began to practice emotional independence. It wasn't easy. At first, he felt numb. But it wasn't numbness, it was clarity. He could still feel deeply, but he no longer clung. He could enjoy connection without fearing disconnection. He could give without begging for something in return. He reminded himself often, detachment isn't disconnection, it's discipline. It's standing in the middle of desire and still choosing yourself. He stopped reacting to every text. He stopped explaining every decision, and slowly, the leash others held on his emotions began to disintegrate. That evening, walking home through the fading sunlight, John felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not elation, not excitement, but peace. The kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's presence. He whispered to himself with certainty, I need nothing. I am everything. That wasn't ego, it was freedom. And for the first time, he really knew that the man who needs nothing cannot be controlled. He had become untethered, and that made him powerful. Fear. That was the next frontier. John realized that most of his compromises, every stifled word, every fake smile, every time he stayed silent, had one source: fear. Not just fear of failure or embarrassment, but the deeper fear of being rejected, misunderstood, or left behind. But fear is a liar. It whispers that comfort equals safety. It convinces us that smallness is survival, and it thrives in the dark corners of avoidance. John had been avoiding too much. Conflict, confrontation, truth, all in the name of keeping the peace. But peace without power is just submission with a prettier name. He began confronting his fears one by one, not through reckless action, but through steady exposure. He spoke up in a meeting when it would have been easier to stay quiet. He declined an invitation out of alignment with his values. He admitted to himself truths he'd buried for years. Each time, the fear lost a little power, and with that loss, John grew. He understood now, the only way out of fear is through it. Running only feeds it. But when you turn around and face it directly, you discover something profound. Fear is hollow. It only has as much power as you give it. He recalled the words of Marcus Aurelius. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. John's fears weren't facts, they were projections. And when he stopped negotiating with them, they began to dissolve. That night, standing in his dimly lit apartment, John stared into the mirror. Not to admire himself, but to face himself. His voice was low but unwavering. Fear serves me. It was more than a mantra. It was a turning point. He would no longer be ruled by what-ifs. He would walk into the fire of uncertainty and claim whatever strength the flames offered. Because once you master fear, you master the game. And John was done playing small. John once believed control meant having authority over others, positions, power, influence. But now he saw clearly. True control is internal. It's the discipline to command yourself in a world that constantly tries to pull you in 1,000 directions. He looked back on the moments he'd lost control, not in rage or explosion, but in quiet surrender. The times he said yes out of guilt, the nights he scrolled mindlessly, avoiding the work that mattered, the times he let someone's mood dictate his own, all of it, leakage of power. So he began the work of reclaiming himself. He established boundaries, not just with people, but with habits. No more reactive mornings, no more unguarded time. He woke up early, trained his body, wrote in silence, not for aesthetics or performance, but to sharpen his will. He understood now what Machiavelli meant when he wrote, "He who cannot control himself will be controlled by others." In modern terms, If you don't command your attention, advertisers will. If you don't guide your emotions, manipulators will. If you don't choose your path, society will choose it for you. John's control grew from the inside out. He no longer rushed to reply to messages. He didn't explain himself unnecessarily. He spoke less, but when he did, his words landed. And when provoked, he didn't react. That restraint confused people, and that confusion created space. He was no longer easy to read, and that made him powerful. But more than that, it made him peaceful. His energy wasn't scattered. His presence wasn't erratic. It was deliberate. That's what made the difference, not his job title or bank account, but the sense that John was unshakable. That's what control feels like, not tightness, but sovereignty. And in the quiet of his apartment, after another day of unbending discipline, he wrote the words that had now become law. I am control. I am power. He didn't just believe them. He embodied them. Because in a world built on chaos and reaction, control is the last rebellion, and John had chosen to become its master. There came a moment, late on a Thursday, when John looked around and saw it all clearly. The world wasn't built for men like him, not yet. It was built for the obedient, the predictable, the easily managed. But something in him had shifted. He no longer fit the mold. Most people lived reactively. Wake up, scroll, work, complain, sleep, repeat. They weren't alive, they were processed, moved not by intention, but by impulse. John had been there. He knew the cycle. But he also knew he wasn't going back. He had stepped into a new frame, the predator's mindset, not predatory in cruelty, but in clarity. He stopped chasing opportunities that didn't respect him. He stopped begging for relationships that only took. He waited, he watched, he planned. And when he moved with precision. This mindset wasn't about aggression, it was about sovereignty. The predator doesn't flinch, he doesn't explain, he doesn't plead, he studies, he understands, and when the time comes, he acts, quietly, strategically, without fanfare. That kind of presence unsettles people because it reveals contrast. The herd senses the outlier, and it unnerves them. John realized he didn't need to prove his power. He needed to withhold it, to smile only when it served him, to speak only when it mattered. His unpredictability became his armor. People couldn't read him, so they couldn't control him. And without control, they showed him something new, respect. Standing in the elevator alone, descending into the parking garage, John whispered the truth that had rewritten his identity. I am the predator. I do not chase. I command. He didn't say it with bravado. He said it with certainty. Because a man who embodies quiet strength doesn't need to raise his voice. His very presence speaks for him. And now, John's presence had changed, not because he became louder, but because he became sovereign. The world had not yet caught up, but it would. One glance at him, and it already knew. Something dangerous had awakened. Every empire falls the same way. Quietly, then all at once. But it never begins with the enemy at the gate. It begins with the erosion from within. John had studied enough history to understand that. What he hadn't realized until now was that the same rule applied to men. A man without inner defenses isn't free. He's exposed, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, not because the world is evil, but because the world is indifferent. Without a personal fortress, he is at the mercy of every insult, every manipulation, every shift in opinion. John had lived that way. He didn't want to anymore. So he built walls, not to keep love out, but to keep weakness from getting in. He began to sort what mattered from what didn't. Every compliment, every criticism, every whispered opinion that used to derail him, he put them through a filter. Does this serve my mission? If not, it was discarded. He called this process fortress work. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't public, but it was powerful. Each time he said no to something that once controlled him, whether it was people-pleasing, procrastination, or the need to explain himself, a brick was laid. Each time he held his composure in chaos, another wall rose. Over time, his energy shifted. People sensed the difference. He didn't flinch when ignored. He didn't collapse when challenged. He didn't crave reassurance. He chose who entered his space, and more importantly, why. This wasn't detachment from humanity. It was sovereignty over it. He was no longer a castle built on sand. That Sunday evening, as rain tapped softly against his window, John lit a candle, sat in silence, and wrote one line in his journal. "I am my fortress. I cannot be broken." It was more than words. It was his architecture. In a world where everyone leaks themselves into noise, he was becoming a man who stood immovable. And that stillness, calm, sharp, and cold, became his signal. You could trust him, but you could not shake him. And that made all the difference. Everything John had rebuilt in himself, clarity, discipline, detachment, was converging into a single identity. He wasn't just acting differently. He was becoming someone else. Not someone new, but someone he had buried long ago beneath expectations and fear. He was becoming untouchable. Untouchable didn't mean invincible. It meant unowned. It meant John no longer needed external forces to define his value. He could listen without absorbing, love without clinging, lead without explaining. That's what freedom feels like, not the absence of responsibility, but the absence of dependency. He noticed the change everywhere, the way people looked at him, the way conversations shifted when he entered a room. He no longer filled silences out of nervousness. He let them hang. And in those moments, others revealed themselves. He had become a mirror, and that made him powerful. John lived by 3 laws now. First, self-sufficiency, no longer depending on others for worth, peace, or direction. Second, emotional neutrality. Compliments and insults hit the same wall. Third, ruthless direction. Every action was aligned to his mission. He had no time for detours and no patience for distractions dressed as opportunities. This didn't make him cruel. It made him clean. And clean power feels like silence, not absence, but presence without desperation. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was the one people listened to, not because he demanded it, but because he didn't. One night, standing on the rooftop of his apartment building, city lights flickering like silent applause below, John breathed in the cold night air and whispered, "I am untouchable. I bow to no one." It wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. He had stripped away everything that made him chase. What remained was the man he was always meant to be. Not perfect, not polished, but unshaken. And in a world built on control and chaos, that kind of man is rare, and rare is power. As autumn deepened, the changes in John were no longer internal. They had become undeniable to everyone around him. His presence was different. He didn't need to declare his transformation. It radiated through his posture, his silence, and his gaze. He wasn't performing anymore. He was simply being. Colleagues who used to talk over him now paused when he spoke. Friends who once leaned on him for emotional labor began to self-correct in his presence. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. They sensed that John had shifted from accessible to selective, and that made every second of his attention more valuable. He learned something important. When you stop chasing, you start choosing. When you stop explaining, people start listening. And when you stop needing, you start leading. John wasn't detached from life. He was engaged with it on his terms. His fortress gave him perspective. His detachment gave him leverage. His silence gave him influence. The irony of power is this: the more you grasp for it, the more it eludes you. But the more grounded you become, the more the world gravitates toward you, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. John had become someone who could not be moved, not by praise, not by rejection, not by pressure. He walked through life now as if every step was a choice, not a reaction. He didn't flinch when people left. He didn't celebrate when they stayed. His energy no longer depended on the actions of others. He had replaced fragility with focus, anxiety with direction, noise with stillness. That night, as he journaled by lamplight, he wrote a single sentence at the top of the page: "Stability is the new charisma." He didn't need charm. He didn't need attention. He had presence. And in a world of loud desperation, that alone made him unforgettable. Because real power doesn't shout. It just enters the room, and everything else adjusts. John began noticing the contrast between himself and the world with increasing clarity. He no longer resented it. He studied it. Most people were drifting, their lives dictated by outside forces, opinions, trends, likes, gossip, but John moved differently. He no longer swam in those waters. He walked on the shore, dry and unmoved. He understood now. Most men weren't weak by nature. They were simply undisciplined. They had the potential for strength, but it was buried under addiction to comfort. Their routines weren't built, they were inherited, and their choices weren't choices at all, they were habits disguised as personality. John had dismantled all of that. He didn't scroll mindlessly anymore. He didn't engage in gossip. He didn't react to provocation. He had replaced stimulation with structure. Mornings were his training ground. Cold showers, quiet meditation, focused writing. Not because they were trendy, but because they were necessary. Discipline had become his ritual, not for punishment, but for peace. Each habit was a signal to himself, I am in command. His body, once sluggish, was now sharp. His mind, once scattered, was now centered. His soul, once restless, was now still. He no longer feared solitude. He had mastered it. In that silence, he met the man underneath the noise. People around him began to ask, often quietly, sometimes awkwardly, what changed? He would smile, not with arrogance, but with understanding, because the answer wasn't in what he added, but in what he removed. Distractions, excuses, approval-seeking. He had subtracted everything that blurred his vision, and what remained was truth. Late one evening, John looked at his reflection, not to adjust his appearance, but to honor it. He saw a man who no longer needed the world to clap, a man who built his throne, not from gold, but from grit. He spoke aloud just once. I am built, not born. It wasn't a boast. It was a fact. And that fact changed everything. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, John found that silence no longer unsettled him. It became sanctuary. He didn't fill the empty spaces with noise. He filled them with purpose. When others escaped into distraction, John leaned into focus. He realized the ultimate power wasn't dominance over others. It was dominance over self. And with that realization, his movements became intentional. Every word, every gesture, every pause carried weight. He no longer rushed to answer. He no longer flinched at discomfort. He met life with stillness, not urgency. John had entered the rarest territory of all, presence. The kind of presence that doesn't seek approval, the kind that doesn't entertain nonsense, the kind that sees through masks and responds only to truth. People noticed. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. Some were drawn to him, others avoided him. That was fine. He no longer measured himself by reactions. He measured himself by alignment. If a room didn't suit his values, he left. If a conversation lacked depth, he didn't force connection. His boundaries were no longer a wall. They were a filter. And what remained after the filtering was quality. One afternoon, standing in line at a coffee shop, a younger man turned to him and asked, "How do you stay so grounded?" John paused before answering. Then, with a calm tone, he replied, I stopped outsourcing my peace. That moment stuck, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. In a world spinning faster every day, John had slowed down, and in that stillness, he had found clarity. It wasn't that the world had changed, he had, and that internal shift made him untouchable, not in bravado, but in essence. That evening, as dusk blanketed the city, John stood by his window, watching the lights flicker on like quiet affirmations. He closed his eyes and repeated the phrase that now lived in his bones, I am the calm in the storm. He didn't just believe it, he had become it. Winter arrived with sharp winds and long nights, but for John, the cold brought clarity, not gloom. As others sought warmth through distraction, he leaned further into solitude, not as retreat, but as refinement. He wasn't escaping the world, he was preparing to lead within it. The man who once feared rejection now welcomed it. The man who once needed applause now preferred silence. Because he had learned, when you no longer need what others hold over you, they lose their grip. That is what it means to become sovereign. Sovereignty didn't make John cruel. It made him clear. He wasn't detached from humanity. He was detached from illusion. He loved more purely now because his love came without demand. He helped others more wisely because he no longer sacrificed himself to do so. He had become the man others leaned on, not because he offered comfort, but because he offered clarity. He had no desire to be a savior. That role belonged to fiction. But he knew that the best way to uplift others was to become the proof. Proof that a man can break the cycle. Proof that a man can lose everything familiar and still build something better. Proof that strength and kindness are not opposites, but reflections of the same foundation, truth. On a walk through a quiet neighborhood blanketed in snow, John stopped beneath a street lamp and took in the stillness. No noise, no distraction, just breath, light, and presence. In that moment, he realized something. He wasn't waiting for life to happen anymore. He was happening to life. And that changed everything. Because once you stop waiting for permission, once you stop asking to be seen, you become undeniable. Not because of loudness, but because of alignment. Not because of domination, but because of direction. John whispered once more, not to the world, but to himself. I move in silence, and I move with purpose. The words melted into the night, but the conviction remained, and from that night forward, his presence no longer entered rooms. It shifted them. The transformation was never about perfection. It was about power, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself but moves like gravity. John had become that force, not a storm, but a center, not a conqueror, but a compass. He didn't control others. He didn't need to. He controlled himself, and that was enough. The world didn't stop spinning. People still gossiped. Distractions still existed, but none of it pulled him anymore. He had stepped out of the current, and in doing so, he became the current for others, a silent example. A man who didn't just speak about strength, but lived it. He no longer sought milestones. He sought moments. And in those moments, he led, not through command, but through consistency. Not through dominance, but through discipline. He gave without draining. He loved without losing. And he stood without swaying. This was not the ending. It was the beginning. The beginning of a life authored by clarity, driven by truth, and shaped by sovereignty. John would still fall. He would still face doubt. But he would never again be ruled by it. Because once you've built your fortress, worn the right mask, mastered your fear, and chosen your direction, you don't return to the herd. You walk forward, alone if needed, but never lonely. Because peace walks with you. On a quiet morning, as sunlight poured through his window, John sat with a cup of black coffee and a blank page before him. No pressure, no noise, just possibility. And he wrote the final words of his old self. I am untouchable. I bow to no one. That wasn't a declaration to the world. It was a covenant with himself, a line between who he had been and who he would never be again. And now, it's your turn. If this journey stirred something in you, if you felt the pull to become more, to rise, to reclaim the man buried beneath the noise, then don't just listen, move, like this video. Subscribe to the channel and write your truth in the comments below. Declare it, I am untouchable. I bow to no one. Because this is more than a story. This is the blueprint, and now it's yours to build.